Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. My name is Martin Keeble, CEO of Credit Suisse in Japan. Nice to see so many people here, and I take it as an indication that despite the small retrenchment in the Nikkei we've seen this year, that there's still some very good interest in Japan. It's a great honor for me to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Yoshihiko Noda, who served as the Prime Minister of Japan between September 2011 and December 2012. Former Prime Minister Noda has had a highly distinguished political career, first elected to the House of Representatives in 1993. He was appointed Parliamentary Senior Vice Minister of Finance in 2009 and Minister of Finance the following year, in what was the first post-war Democratic Party government in Japan. As Prime Minister, Mr. Noda led Japan in the aftermath of the terrible crisis caused by the 2011 earthquake. He was instrumental in the rapid recovery and rebuilding efforts after the quake, and also started the debate about what was a sustainable and politically acceptable energy policy for Japan. And as we all know, this debate continues to this day, and indeed is the subject of two separate sessions at the conference on Wednesday. Mr. Noda's speech today comes at a critical time for Japan. The current leadership has embarked on an ambitious plan to revitalise Japan's economy, utilising the so-called three arrows of aggressive monetary policy, fiscal stimulus and economic reform. This fiscal stimulus is required to boost the economy at a time when the government must also rein in public debt, which has spiralled for more than 2 decades. Therefore, the key question remains: how will Japan's government continue to balance the need for economic growth with fiscal responsibility? To lead the discussion today, I would like to also introduce you to the Right Honourable Sir John Major, former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and Special Advisor to Credit Suisse. Sir John had a long and successful political career, including winning the UK general election in 1992, with the highest number of votes ever obtained by any political party in the UK. By common consent, on leaving office in May 1997, he left behind the best economy any incoming UK government has ever inherited. As well as advising Credit Suisse, Sir John holds a number of other business appointments and serves as president or patron of a number of charities, both in the UK and internationally. His links with Japan remain strong. In May 2012, the Emperor of Japan bestowed the Grand Cordon of the Order of the Rising Sun upon Sir John in recognition of his invaluable contribution to Japan-UK relations through his work not only in the political and economic arena, but also in promoting mutual understanding. As Prime Minister, Sir John stressed the need for a true strategic partnership between the two countries, and he played an important role in the steady development of closer bilateral ties in many fields. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming former Prime Minister Sir John Major and former Prime Minister Yoshihiko Noda to the AIC.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yoshihiko Noda. I hope all of you have the receivers ready for me for translation. Are we good? I will be speaking in my favorite and my most proficient language, Japanese. First of all, I would like to extend my appreciation to all of you from Credit Suisse, and of course the Honorable Sir John Major, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, for this opportunity. Actually, last time I had the honor of meeting Sir Major was back in April 2012. Sir Major has been awarded by His Imperial Highness Grand Cordon of the Order of the Rising Sun. As a Prime Minister, I was standing right beside His Imperial Highness, so it has been the first time since then I have had the honor of meeting him. And all of you here, you're welcome to continue enjoying your lunch as I speak. And of course, quite often it is very difficult to conduct presentation, lunch, and after lunch. Quite often people get asleep or quite sleepy. And you are welcome to take a nap as well, if you wish. So at the end of 2012, I handed the administration over to Mr. Abe. So Abenomics have been formally launched, and since then, stock prices have been surging. However, on the other hand, we are hearing more decline in expectations for the implementation of the so-called third arrow for the growth strategy. And of course, we are seeing uncertainty in the emerging markets. Therefore, the outlook of a Japanese economy, we cannot be overly optimistic. Politics and diplomacy are quite often explained by an analogy to gardening. Plants, just by sowing seeds and leaving it as is, they would not bloom. We would have to plow out the weeds, give them sunshine, and of course water them every day. If there are any buds that may potentially inhibit growth, we would have to remove them at the earliest pace possible. So some of you present today might have expected me to criticize the current regime and emphasize on the risks. You might have expected this to happen. However, I would rather talk about the seeds that I had sown in the past and that they have grown steadily within the Japanese economy. That would be the topic of the day. So 3 years back, Mr. Abe, I think he had the opportunity to make a presentation when he was still in the opposition party. Apparently, Mr. Abe criticized quite heavily DPJ. I am not like him. I will not be taking that position. Of course, I would request to the current administration that they would have to make proper care of the garden. Of course, that request will be made from me. So the starting point of the Japanese economic policy, basically the measures against the declining birth rate and the aging society. So it embodies two issues, namely the detrimental effect on public finance and, of course, decrease in productivity of the productive age population. So as far as the impact on public finance is concerned, during my cabinet, we have launched the comprehensive reform of Social Security and taxation system. So during my term as Prime Minister, this is an issue of domestic politics that I have really risked my political life upon. It was indeed quite difficult for me to proceed with this. The current Abe regime, in line with the legislation, they have decided to increase the tax rate to 8% from next month. And by doing so, Japan was able to show strong commitment for restoring the fiscal soundness of the country. Also, as far as the finance for JGB is concerned, first of all, Japanese yen is an international currency. It could be traded anywhere in the world. Therefore, it could be said JGB market had its own depths and liquidity. This is indeed the strengths of JGB. And of course, what is more important is the Japanese fiscal policy has gained the confidence of the world, and that is why we are seeing the current low interest rate. This point should never waver, and I would like to have the current regime people have this well understood. Of course, I would strongly hope that they would have the will to further move on to increase the consumption tax rate to 10%. The second point related to the decline in the productivity. Of course, it is important to come up with measures for declining birth rate in aging society. We would also have to promote participation of women into the labor force and, of course, come up with measures for entry of the foreign labor. These concrete measures are necessary. However, it would take some time for these reforms to bear fruit. I have strong expectations, and the measures that I have been taking since my cabinet is to realize Japan that grows together with Asia. There are two meanings behind this. First of all, the Japanese corporates would conduct business in Asia. They would employ the local people, and in the end, the profits would be returned back to Japan. Another point to mention, we would make Japan such an attractive place for investment, and we would increase investment from various countries in Asia, and by doing so, we should be able to revitalize the economy. Asian GDP is now approaching close to 30% of the world, and its share is increasing every year. The population is about half of the world, and the average age of ASEAN countries range between 20s to mid-30s. Excuse me, we have huge potential. We have huge potential in Asia. In Japan, we have a manufacturing technology that we can boast to the world. And of course, we have the financial sector, which has become much more robust after the financial crisis. So how can we draw a picture in which we can grow together with Asia? In the past couple of years, the Japanese companies' overseas expansion has been accelerated. In fact, the number of Japan-affiliated local subsidiaries in the overseas is close to 25,000. And the number of employees as of 2012, it is a record high number, 5.23 million. We are seeing such growth especially in Indonesia, Thailand, and Vietnam, all these ASEAN regions. I'd like to share with you one episode of this mid-scale electronic equipment makers located in the regional parts of Japan. It was founded 80 years ago. Initially, they started with the textile industry, but since the 1970s rapid economic growth period, they have made a new entry into the electronic world, started manufacturing calculators, then into semiconductors. And making use of its expertise in the optical semiconductor industry, they have the top share in the world. Paid in capital is less than 100 million yen. The number of employees, 800. But already they have 13 group companies around Asia. They made their first entry into the overseas market only 20 years ago. But in the past 10 years, they have newly established bases such as factories in 11 places. Recently, they are making parts and components for smartphones. And they have relocated the production bases from Thailand to Vietnam in line with the request of the customers. During peak seasons, they employ local staff up to the number of 6,000, and they continue to supply the major components, which is obviously rapidly changing and, of course, quite fierce in terms of competition. So this really outstanding technology, passion, frontier spirit, and of course, this resilience to maintain the utmost quality in response to the requests of the customers. All these are quite encouraging to us. And of course, we would like to continue to support the activities of these SMEs who boast such high level of technology in the world. Let me share with you another example, how Japan and Asia, the business sector, will work together and grow together. I am a huge fan of Japanese sake. In Hong Kong, as you know, as an export destination of sake, it is actually number 2 in the world after the United States. And in terms of the share by country, it's 16% in terms of the all export on the value basis. Let's think about this. This tasty Japanese sake, these sake brewers have a joint venture with Hong Kong companies, and they sell it in Hong Kong. And the people in Hong Kong would enjoy those sake. And these Hong Kong companies would, in turn, invest in the sake breweries that they like. And the business would flourish in the overseas front. And all over the world, the people would enjoy the Japanese sake. This is quite an exciting thought.
Just listening to this type of story makes me very excited. Then let me explain how the Japanese government actually helping and supporting the Japanese enterprises to conduct business overseas. So this is just an example of the seeds that I've sowed during my administration. There are 3 of them. And the first one is the financial support that it provides to the Japanese companies. Oftentimes, it is said that when they enter into overseas markets, they face challenges in terms of financing in local currencies. Especially the Japanese SME do not appear to have enough credit worthiness in those regions so that it is quite difficult for them to receive bank loans. Therefore, when I had to become the finance minister in 2010, I implemented policy which ensures that the Japanese SMEs to secure bank loans when they enter overseas markets, including Asia. The policy allows the Japanese government-affiliated financial institutions directly issue loans to local banks in other countries, or Japanese commercial banks provide guarantees for the SMEs, which is seeking loans and capital in the overseas markets so they can receive the bank loans from the local banks in local currencies. This is not only facilitates expansion of business by Japanese companies, but it also allows local financial institutions in concerned countries to lend money to the Japanese enterprises without increasing their credit risk. This really contributes to the idea of growing together with Asia. Many Japanese companies have so far taken advantage of the scheme and have successfully expanded their business in the Asian region. The second initiative is to promoting and requesting other countries' local financial authorities for their regulations. In some countries, there are tight financial regulations in order to protect their own domestic industries and employment, and also to prevent sudden inflows and outflows of capital. However, they can often become an obstacle for business expansion for both sides. For example, there's a regulation called the preferential loan regulations in India. This is to allocate a certain percentage of loans by financial institutions to the government-designated sectors and industry, for example, SME and agricultural sector, let's say. As a result, commercial banks are sometimes forced to cut down the large-size loans to big-size projects such as infrastructure project, or sometimes that could have gone to the good-performing companies. In some countries, it even directly regulates the loan by the local financial institution to foreign companies, and they are not often able to meet financial needs of their clients. Our government has been requesting its counterparts to deregulate these restrictions, not only for the interest of Japan, but also for their own sustainable growth and for the benefit of banks and business in their own countries. And we have made a certain progress in this area. The third initiative is to liberate the cross-border flows of goods and service. Under my administration, Japan had made a decision to participate in TPP negotiation. This is because we believed it was important to be an active participant of this rulemaking process. Its ultimate goal is to establish an open trade system. There must have been many reasons behind the scene. However, it is very unfortunate to see that the agreement couldn't be reached in the recent ministerial meeting. The agreement on TPP will stimulate cross-border business in Asia and also can be the major driver for the reforms in participating countries. Therefore, I would like to reiterate the importance of the early agreement on TPP. Recently, I often hear following concerns over the Japanese fiscal status. Since its productivity declines due to aging society and low birth rate, it would fall into the perpetual current account deficit. In order to support the aging society with a low birth rate, continuous issue of JGP and the decline in tax revenue become inevitable. Therefore, Japan will keep suffering from twin deficit and won't be able to finance JGP and result in collapse of Japan. I would like to address these issues based on my idea of living and growing together with Asia. Let's focus on the reasons behind the recent increase in the trade deficit. The trade balance deteriorated in 2013 by 1.8 trillion yen compared to 2010, which was before the earthquake. Breakdown of this 1.8 trillion yen is increase of import by 20 trillion yen, increase of export by 2 trillion yen. It is obvious this was caused by the drastic increase in import. Out of the 20 trillion yen increase, half of it, 10 trillion yen, comes from the energy-related import. This is mainly caused by the complete shutdown of the nuclear power plants in Japan. Needless to say, energy import is a major issue we are facing. It is imperative to plan strategic policies from a long-term perspective so that we can achieve the objectives, such as reduction of nuclear power dependency and the development of low-cost renewable energy. Each country also has to present specific measures for low-carbon growth to make sure energy restrictions do not hinder respective economic growth. On the other hand, there are some structural reasons or factors behind this. For example, import of IT device and equipment has increased by 1.4 trillion yen in the last 3 years, and also clothing and fashion accessories import increased by 0.9 trillion yen. It is largely caused by the reverse of the import of casual fashion wears and smartphones. In other words, these numbers partially include the impact of the relocation of Japanese manufacturing to overseas. The fact that Japanese companies with high technological capabilities and knowledge are moving their manufacturing to overseas can contribute to further sustainable growth in Asia. At the same time, this can also benefit Japanese economy through reflux of profit by business expansion. Investment return by Japanese companies' overseas business has increased by 4 trillion yen in last 3 years, and this number can offset the majority of the trade deficit, excluding the energy-related items. More Japanese corporations enjoy higher returns by actively making investments in overseas, and this would improve our current account balance and boost domestic capex and consumption and result in a higher tax revenue. And further, Japanese investment in Asian emerging markets can help respective countries' economy to recover and achieve steady growth. If Japan can increase its export to other countries, the scenario would be even better. We have to make an utmost effort to establish a foundation of prosperity so that we can achieve Japan rich growth together with Asia, bring about the affluent future to Asia. And the coexistence of fiscal integrity and economic growth are an essential for our prosperity. An early agreement of TPP and comprehensive economic cooperation in East Asia must be simultaneously pursued. In addition, setting up an adequate environment for cross-border business activity would help each other to grow its economy in a sustainable, stable manner. For that purpose, financial authorities in respective countries must coordinate with one another and establish the mechanism that allows an efficient and appropriate supply of capitals required for the economic activities. Moreover, a close coordination among the leaders of concerned countries and enhancement of the security for stability and social orders in that region are even more important. As a statement of Japan, I have been trying to transform the soil quality, which was impoverished from the past growth and harvesting, into the stronger one and the more fertile one. I also have been sowing the seeds of the flowers that would bloom in several years or even in several decades in this soil. We can enjoy the harvest of the effort made by the previous generation, but at the same time, we have to work hard to cultivate the soil, sow the seeds, and nurture the buds and the sprouts for the next generations. I will keep trying my hardest to help Japan to make a rich, beautiful flowers bloom and further contribute to the prosperity of Asia in the future. I have been. Thank you very much for your attention without falling asleep. I really appreciate your patience. Thank you very much.
Well, Prime Minister, thank you very much indeed. I think your speech will have sparked a lot of interest amongst this audience. The way we're going to proceed from now on, I will ask a handful of questions, no more than 3, and then I will throw the questions open to the audience. It'd be a great help if they could actually be questions when you come to ask them. And perhaps if you're worried about that, I should mention that the Prime Minister has a black belt in judo. So you may wish to be aware of that when you ask your question over the next few minutes. Prime Minister, this is essentially an investment conference. So I wonder if I could begin by turning first to current and future economic policy. If you average out the last 20 years, Japanese growth has averaged something a little under 1%. To what extent do you think current policy is likely to change that over the long term? Firstly, what do you think is a realistic growth target for the next few years? And secondly, related to that, what domestic structural reforms, the third arrow, do you actually anticipate? Are we going to see deregulation of labour and capital markets? Are we going to see a big increase in women at work? What do you think is practically likely to occur over the next few years?
Sir Major, thank you very much for an excellent question. In terms of the GDP growth, the economic growth target for Japan on a midterm basis, and the nominal growth ratio 3%, and a real term basis 2%. I would hope that we can secure that growth target. That is our basic policy. Well, of course, having said that, and you've talked about the 20-year past trajectory, the average, as you rightly mentioned, we've actually trended quite low in terms of the growth rate. So some of the main pillars of the economic policy back then, we were much more focused on investment in public works. And this is equivalent of the second arrow of Abenomics. So basically more fiscal policy was the main target. So since 1990s to 2009, and the 20 years of course, the amount of public works investment was 200 trillion yen. And it had no backing of the public finance. Therefore, we had made huge amount of debt. 430 trillion yen. So 430 trillion yen of debt and 200 trillion yen of public works investment. But of course, those 2 decades were lost 2 decades, as you recall. Therefore, the public works investment was only on a short-term basis. So economic policy dependent on short-term stimulus is not effective. We know that as a lesson. And we would hope that Abenomics need the concrete measures, given that into consideration. So probably what it will be important going forward, of course, we have 3 arrows. It's the third arrow. That is the growth strategy. That would become the most important. The first arrow has been launched already. That is the monetary easing. Likewise, the second point, the fiscal policy, fiscal stimulus, it has been launched already. So they have made some level of achievement already. However, the third arrow, that is the growth strategy, it is true that they're aiming at the right target. There's no question about that. But so far, all the errors or all the efforts lack that strength to reach that target so far. So the question is, how can we really launch that arrow strong enough to really strike that target? That would be the main target. So really, the true worth of the government, it is in question now. Of course, there could be many, many concrete measures towards that. We need bold deregulation. That is the main issue here, especially in terms of deregulation and the medical area, agricultural area. In these areas, we need to deep dive on the deregulation. We need to have much more depth in the deregulation. So of course the issue here is there are many, many stakeholders, not just in Japan, but of course in the rest of the world as well. So these stakeholders, these strong lobby, if they have those, and sometimes they're resilient against change. So really, the true worth of the government is whether they can withstand that and really go forth with those measures. Of course, we would like them to be successful. We are opposition, but we do hope that the current administration would succeed. So we would watch carefully the future trends. I hope I answered your question, sir.
Prime Minister, thank you very much indeed.
総理どうもありがとうございました。その
Important to growth in the future. You mentioned in your speech the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And you said, if I recall correctly, that you thought early agreement was needed. Can I ask you whether you think early agreement is likely to be obtained? And what domestic difficulties will a TPP agreement cause within Japan? And if I can add to that, where do you think we are on the economic partnership agreement with the European Union?
残念ながらですね、ドーハラウンド
Okay, Doha round unfortunately hasn't made a progress as they had initially anticipated. Under the circumstances, more liberated investment, more liberated trade scheme
マルチの関係で
has to be at the regional basis. It has to be multi-agreement. And this is something we have to work on for a while. So TPP negotiations and the discussion, and there was many discussions within domestic markets because there are many industries that would be impacted. And so under the administration, we had a certain amount of the discussions. As for the TPP, Asia Pacific is one team, and this is like one of the groups. I remember I had a strong impression from the discussion with President Obama. Unfortunately, Mr. Obama, he was always like voicing and representing a specific the industries like interest. So therefore, I asked him to see a broader view or the picture. The Sir Major, you're from England, and you remember the Beatles from your country, the TPP. We can basically use the TPP Beatles as an analogy to TPP. America is more like a John Lennon, and Japan is a Paul McCartney. The Beatles without Paul McCartney doesn't really make sense, doesn't it? So, of course, I'm not saying other countries represent Ringo Starr or like George Harrison, but John Lennon and Paul McCartney have to get along. And otherwise, there will be no great band. That's what I expressed that to the President Obama. And Mr. Obama said that he likes the Paul McCartney, but because there was a pre-election took place in the U.S., so therefore I guess he couldn't make a bold decision. And unfortunately, America seems to losing the perspective to see the whole picture. And it's really unfortunate that they couldn't really step the last. They couldn't really go all the way, and that was really unfortunate. If there are some the controversies in Japan, I think that's going to be the agricultural sector. But without joining TPP, regardless, this Japanese agricultural industry is still declining. This industry, so therefore they need to really switch their stance. They have to become more vibrant industry together with this TPP agreement. This should be the trigger for them to recover. And of course, the current, the administration is very much dependent on the voters, in the agricultural sector. So therefore, I'm not really sure if they can make the last decision or the bold decision. As for the Doha round, without completion of the Doha round, we need this kind of multilateral agreement. Of course, the TPP. And also the Japan, European, and also East Asian, Japan, China, and Korea. And this agreement is important. Also the RCEP, including ASEAN country, this is important. So therefore, I would like to see the early agreement of TPP. I'm in a opposition party, but I really hope this agreement will be reached very soon.
Well, I hope it is, and we'll ask Paul McCartney to put it to song if it happens. Prime Minister, can I turn to Japanese demand for a moment? there's a round of pay rises about to come up. Toshiba, Honda, Toyota have already said they're going to introduce increased wages from the 1st of April. Very attractive to increase demand. A couple of questions about that. Will the smaller Japanese companies, the SMEs in particular, also be able to raise wages out of increasing profitability? And if the intention is to raise demand, how will this be impacted by the increasing consumption tax also from the 1st of April? Do you expect the net effect of the wage increases and the consumption tax to be a net increase in consumer demand or broadly level?
In terms of wage rise, wage increase, as you rightly mentioned, starting spring of this year, of course, we have seen the labor management talks. So especially in the large corporates, large manufacturing sector, we are seeing more possibilities of wage increase. I believe that is a very positive development. However, the issue is whether it would spread to the rest of the industry. And another point you've mentioned, sir, whether it would spread to the SMEs or not. And what about spreading to non-manufacturing sector? So non-manufacturing sector and SMEs, we are not seeing a significant improvement in the productivity. So it might be difficult to increase wage in those specific sectors. So, of course, we need to cautiously watch what will become going forward. That is the first point. So in Japan, in collaboration with BOJ, within the next 2 years, we would like to increase the prices by 2%. Various efforts have been made. But of course, that is quite a demanding target. But in order to reach that target, we need to have certain level of wage increase. If the prices go up, but the wages do not go up in line with it, obviously, the Japanese people would have a tough time. Therefore, a cautious approach is necessary going forward. And as of 1st of April, consumption tax would be rise from 5% to 8%, 3% incremental of tax. And this is based on the legislation that I have formulated back in my cabinet, back in my administration. So the question is, what sort of impact would it pose on the economy? Of course, we would see that last-minute demand prior to the tax hike. And we are bound to see backlash as well after the tax hike. I think that is a common phenomenon wherever you go in the world. Therefore, in April-June quarter in Japan, the economy would be somewhat depressed because of the backlash after the tax hike. But this needs to be overcome. And again, it is not just Japan. As the title denotes, we need to strike the right balance between growth and fiscal improvement. As a country, you need to achieve that. And I believe Japan has that capability to do so. So for July-September quarter, we should be back to normal, and we should track towards growth. And we need to have that macroeconomic policy to enable that. So for that purpose, again, the third era of Abenomics needs to be launched and needs to be finalized at the earliest phase possible. Of course, if I were in the cabinet, I could be much more bold in saying which measures to take. But as an opposition, we can only check and monitor what will become. But let's just say July-September quarter onwards, we would hope and we would work together to get back on that growth trajectory.
Prime Minister, thank you very much. Right, we can now take questions from the floor, if you could indicate in the usual way. And I will see who catches my eye. Who would like to start? Yes.
Yes, pleasure having you, former Prime Minister Noda. It was wonderful to see that the Japanese government is paying for 80% of the kindergartens, new kindergartens, public and private in Japan, that came in I think a few weeks ago. So the Japanese government will be paying for 80% of the cost of the new kindergartens, which would be great for Japanese women who want to both have children and work. But my question is, in terms of agriculture, quite frankly, the Japanese farmers are, in a way, their own worst enemies. The agricultural system in Japan and the land, a legal position to sell. The farms are very small, unproductive, and there's a huge opportunity for the Japanese to export great products in dairy, fruit and vegetables. You have very good soil, great water, but the Japanese government must be much bolder in being hard on the Japanese farmers to modernize. We've been involved in looking at Japanese investment in agriculture. So what would you say to that? I mean, we have to be harder with them. Can it be done?
There are two questions probably, and one is that you mentioned about this, like the support for the kindergarten and how we can help the Japanese female labor to participate in the labor market. I guess, and the second thing I can mention about this agricultural sector and its reform. And the first of all, Japan. It's like a pension and also the elderly care and also medical. This social security system is in place in Japan. To a certain extent, I can say that. But in order to make it more sustainable, we need earlier, younger generation. They need to be a bit more productive. We need to focus on younger generation. Our demography is changing drastically. And 50 years ago when I was born, so 9 or 10 younger people are supporting one elderly. And that was a structure of the society. And currently, 3 people supporting one elderly. So the demography has changed drastically. And soon enough, one person has to support one person. One labor force has to support one elderly. This ratio, I'm not really sure. This is like, we said the kataguruma, it's like you put like a person on the shoulder, and like have you put your a child on your shoulder? Have you tried this? I guess this is a particular culture in Japan, like a piggyback. If you do the piggyback, the child, and that's easy. But if you're trying to do the piggyback, the adult, that's really difficult. When I was cleaning, spring cleaning in my house, I put my wife on my shoulder. It was very, very heavy, and I hurt my back. So in order to, overcome this a piggyback era or the period, what are we going to do? Of course, we have to think about the person on the shoulder, but you have to think about the person whose shoulder as well. So basically, this is more like a comprehensive the social security. So we had enough social security for labor force, and of course, this is like support the child or the child rearing, and that's most important social security for the younger labor force. So if we don't do this, we won't be able to support the system. So this is, of course, I like the Abe administration to keep these policies that I had proposed earlier, keep supporting this child rearing generations, and more subsidy for the kindergartens and the youngsters. And also, as for the agriculture, this is not the end. I went to Aeon. This is a Japanese supermarket in Hong Kong. I had a chance to visit yesterday, and there are so many Japanese food, fruits, other food, and also the rice. They're very good products. You can see they are safe and tasty and high quality. And thus, Japan is a country which is producing all those products. This is a weapon that needs to be well known, better known. And the people in Hong Kong have a very good knowledge about Japanese food, Japanese seafood, and also the fresh products. Hong Kong is the biggest importer of our products, fresh produce. So it hasn't really spread to other Asian countries and also the Europe and America, I guess we haven't done enough publicity. I think, I believe the Japanese agriculture is still can be competitive. Rather than just protecting blindly, I think we need to encourage them to become more competitive. I absolutely agree with you. Yes, they should be reformed, and also they should become more competitive.
Thank you very much. Next question, please. Yes, just here. Microphone is just coming.
How can, Japanese politicians ever get a grip on the various lobbying groups which you've been mentioning? Because that's the key, basically, to be finally able to embark on those restructuring efforts which are necessary.
Thank you very much for really getting to the point. It is indeed a tough question, but thank you for that. I think the issue is quite obvious. I think we have some level of prescription, let's just say. For some reason, we've always actually passed the issues into the future. So for instance, consumption tax, we should have dealt with it much earlier. For instance, at Koizumi regime, for instance, we should have actually increased the consumption tax. Likewise with agricultural reforms, it has been pointed out all along. But the biggest issue, the biggest flaw of Japanese politics is we tend to push the issues into the future and do not make a decision on the point. Why? Because we are much more concerned about the imminent elections. Agriculture, the medical association, they're quite strong. They're quite strong lobbies. Nobody wants to flunk out. Nobody wants to fail in the election. That's why we listen to them. And the consumption tax and also the security reforms, quite often the voting rate is actually higher for the elderly as opposed to the younger generation. That is why we do not see the opinions being reflected of the younger people into the political will. So we should look at not so much of next election, but more next generation. Again, this is a very tough, very, very tough condition. We tend to think only about the next election, but that would not improve on the state of affairs. So and that is why I didn't do well in next election. But I don't think I was wrong. I think I was on the right track. So I will leave it to history to make a decision on me. And if we see and we have more statesmen like myself, let us hope things might get better. But recently, I am seeing more understanding. More people are understanding my thought. So we do have much more potential for change. So by no means I'm in despair.
Certainly, it is entirely possible to be right and lose an election, believe you me. Right. Yeah, just there.
How worried are you about the global geopolitical tension? I would appreciate if you can also comment on the situation in North Asia. Thank you.
So geopolitical risks. There are many. So I'm not sure which one you're particularly interested in Japan. In general. So when we do the global survey, we are very well liked, like according to almost like all the survey. Japan's like leaving a very good impression to many people in the world. But unfortunately, we are less popular in our neighboring countries. And like our relationship with our neighboring countries are very strained. So we need to improve that. But at least we don't provoke and we don't react to the provocation. I think that's the attitude we have to maintain. We have to remain calm. And of course, this like usually, when we like assert something, the country's interest, it's not 1 to 0. It's like a ratio, the difference is like 51 to 49. We need to have a slight advantages, when you do the diplomatic negotiation. We need to remain calm anyway. So there are few different the geopolitical issues that we are facing, but we need to be persistent. We need to be calm. And of course, with any country, when it comes to like bilateral relationships, there's always 1 or 2 issues. But still, it should not have an impact. It should not have an impact on the whole picture or the overall bilateral relationships. I think, we need to have that mutual understanding. I'm really sorry. Like maybe your question was a bit vague. So, maybe like, my answer was not too specific. I hope that this answers to your question.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, we have a very tight schedule, and I'm afraid that's the last question we have time for. So I'm extremely grateful to the Prime Minister, extremely grateful to him for his speech, and if I may say so, for the elegant and specific way in which you answered the questions put to you. As Prime Minister, I recall that you were very brave. I think you were very brave today. Purely for the record, I may say if I was carrying my wife on my shoulder, she would be very light. And I wish to make that clear before I go home. So, Prime Minister, thank you for an enlivening session. We're extremely grateful to you for being here, and we've learned a lot. Thank you.